Okay, my to-be friends, I don't know if this is going to work. We're going to try the best we can. I'm about to start reading our next chapter book, which I promised you, which is that backwards? The Sasquatch Escape. Here's a little map. Which kind of makes sense since we're learning about maps in social studies. And here we go. Chapter 1, Storybird. The weird shadow swept across the sky. Ben blinked once, twice, 3 times, just in case an eyelash had drifted into one of his eyeballs. But it wasn't an eyelash. Something was moving between the clouds. Something with an enormous wingspan and a long tail. Ben pressed his nose to the passenger window. Grandpa, did you see that? So, you have a voice after all, his grandfather said. I was beginning to think that you had swallowed your tongue. Benjamin Silverstein, age 10, had not swallowed his tongue, but it was true that he hadn't spoken since being picked up at the airport. He had shrugged when his grandfather had asked, "How was your flight?" He had nodded when his grandfather had asked, "Are you hungry?" He had looked away when his grandfather said, "I bet you miss your parents." But not a single word had come out of Ben. After a while, his grandfather had stopped talking. They had driven down the lonely 2-lane highway in silence. There had been nothing interesting to look at, no houses or gas stations or billboards, just trees, lots and lots of trees. But then the shape had appeared, circling, swooping like a wind-kissed kite. I've never seen a bird that big, and it got a tail like a rope. Grandpa Abe slowed the car and then pulled to the side of the highway and to the gravel's shoulder. All right, already. Where's this bird?" he asked after the car came to a stop. "Well, it darted behind that cloud," Ben said. They waited a few minutes, and the bird did not reappear. The fluffy cloud drifted, revealing nothing but the twilight sky. "How big was it?" "Maybe as big as a helicopter?" "As big as a helicopter? And a tail like a rope?" "Uh-huh." "Well, that doesn't sound quite right." Grandpa Abe scratched one of his overgrown gray eyebrows. "I've never seen a bird like that." "Well, I saw it." They waited another minute, but nothing flew out of the cloud. "Is the helicopter bird one of those stories of yours?" Grandpa Abe's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you mean?" "Your mother said that you've been making up stories." "I don't know what you're talking about," Ben grumbled, but he did know. That very morning he had made up a story that the pilot had called the house to cancel Ben's flight because he had lost the keys to the plane. Then Ben made up a story about losing his suitcase so that he wouldn't have to go on his trip. Neither of these stories had worked. His parents had already gone ahead with their plans and sent Ben away. Sometimes Ben's stories worked to his advantage, like the time that he had claimed that California condor had snatched his math homework when actually he had forgotten to finish it. After his teacher pointed out that the California condors don't usually do such things, Ben changed the bird to a pelican. Because pelicans are known as troublemakers, the math teacher gave Ben an extra week to complete the assignment. The way Ben saw it, stories were always more exciting than the actual truth. Grandpa Abe sighed. "I should live so long as to see a bird the size of a helicopter." He set his crinkling hands on the steering wheel and merged back into traffic. Ben sank into a seat and hugged his hamster cage to his chest. The hamster, a Chinese striped variety named Snooze, laid curled beneath the pile of chewed-up newspaper. The pile expanded and contracted with the hamster's breath, slumbering. Ben wished that at that very moment he could be the hamster. Life would certainly be easier if the entire world were in a plastic rectangle. It didn't matter if the rectangle was set on a windowsill in Los Angeles or in the back seat of a Cadillac driving down the highway in the middle of nowhere. The world inside the rectangle always seemed to stay the same. Stuff to chew, stuff to eat and drink, a wheel to waddle around in, no worries, no troubles, no changes. Ah, my son, the storyteller, Grandpa Abe mumbled. The bird wasn't a story, Ben said. It was real. Chapter 2. Welcome to Buttonville. Here we are, Grandpa Abe announced as he exited the highway. The sign at the road read, "Welcome to Buttonville, the nicest town on earth." Grandpa Abe drove down Main Street. The evening sky had darkened, but the corner streetlights shone brightly, casting their glow on the little town. Ben frowned. It didn't look like the nicest town on earth. It looked actually like the saddest town on earth. There were no bright awnings, no fruit corner stands, no sidewalk tables where people sipped their fancy drinks. Instead, many of the little shops that lined Main Street were empty, with signs in the window. This town hasn't been the same since the button factory shut down, Grandpa Abe explained. Most of the young families moved away to find work. Ben had heard all about the button factory. His mother kept a big bowl of buttons in the entertainment room back at home in Los Angeles. "Those buttons were made by your grandfather," she told him. "He worked in a button factory most of his life." "How come the button factory shut down?" Ben asked, peering over the seat. "Well, customers stopped wanting handmade buttons like these," Grandpa Abe replied, pointing to the big wooden buttons on the front of his shirt. "People should be so lucky to get handmade buttons, but it is cheaper to buy those plastic ones made by a machine." Ben's gaze traveled up the wooden buttons and rested on his grandfather's wrinkled face. He hadn't seen his grandfather in 6 years. Ben's dad had said it was because Grandpa Abe didn't like to travel. Because Ben had only been 4 years old at the time, he didn't remember anything about the last visit. In the photos at home, Grandpa Abe had dark hair just like Ben and Ben's dad. But today, not a single hair remained on his shiny scalp. Ben must have been staring pretty hard because his grandfather turned and winked at him. "You look different too," he said. "Your hair is shorter." Ben ran his hand over his hair, which was cut precisely to 3/4 of an inch every 2 weeks. He thought about making up a story that his hair had been cut short because he'd been infested with Caribbean head lice, or because the ends had caught fire when he had been struck by lightning. The real reason Ben's had short hair was because his mother insisted it was stylish. She always took him to the hairdresser in Beverly Hills rather than the barber shop where all the other boys went. The Cadillac pulled up to a stop sign just opposite a shop called the Dollar Store. A girl leaned out the store's upstairs window. It wasn't her fuzzy pink bathrobe that caught Ben's attention, or the way her long blonde hair glowed in the lamplight. What caught his attention was the way she was staring at the sky with her mouth wide open, as if seeing something very, very strange. Ben unfastened his seatbelt. He rolled down the opposite window and stuck his head out. Cool air trickled down his nose and his ears, and a shadow darted across 2 clouds. A shadow with an enormous wing and a long rope-like tail. If Ben had blinked, he would have missed it completely. The girl looked down at Ben. Their eyes met. She had seen it too. Then she mouthed a single word before disappearing behind the curtains. "Do you want me to catch a cold?" Grandpa Abe explained. As Ben closed the window and buckled his seatbelt, Grandpa Abe drove through the intersection and turned onto a side street. Ben wrapped his arms around the hamster cage again. He wasn't an expert at reading lips, but he was pretty certain that he knew what word the girl had said. And that's the end of chapter 2.